The silence inside the warehouse on Mulberry Street wasn't empty. It was heavy. It was the kind of silence that has weight, pressing down on your chest until you have to remind yourself to breathe. March 22nd, 1937, 4:26 in the afternoon, Little Italy, New York. Outside, the city was alive. You could hear the distant grind of trolley cars on Canal Street, the shouting of vendors selling roasted chestnuts, the life of a city that never pauses. But inside this brick tomb, time had stopped. 7 men stood in the shadows. They were soldiers for the Genovese crime family, the muscle behind Charles Lucky Luciano's empire. They were professionals, dressed in charcoal wool suits that smelled of stale tobacco and gun oil. They weren't nervous. Why would they be? They were the hunters. They held the leverage. In the center of the room, tied to a straight-backed wooden chair, sat Thomas Johnson. He wasn't a gangster. He was an accountant. He was 26 years old, with soft hands that were used to turning ledger pages, not firing weapons. His wrists were bruised purple against the rough hemp rope. He could smell the cheap pomade of the man guarding him, a scent of lavender masking the stench of sweat. Thomas looked at the dust motes dancing in the singular beam of light cutting through the gloom, and he prayed. The guards checked their watches. Tick, tick, tick. The second hand swept past the half-hour mark. They lit Lucky Strike cigarettes, the flare of the matches illuminating their confident smirks. They believed they had checkmated the king of Harlem. They believed that by taking Bumpy Johnson's blood, they had put a leash on the devil. They didn't know that the devil was already parked outside. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, sat in the passenger seat. He wasn't checking a watch. He wasn't praying. He was running a thumb over the cold machined steel of a Thompson M1991 submachine gun. He could feel the cooling fins on the barrel, the weight of the 50-round drum magazine loaded with .45 caliber hollow points. Beside him, Illinois Gordon checked the action on a pump-action shotgun. Clack, clack. The sound was final. Bumpy didn't say a word to his crew. He didn't have to. The air inside the car was charged with a kinetic energy, a voltage that was about to discharge into the heart of the Italian stronghold. He looked at the warehouse door. Heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands. It looked impenetrable. To Bumpy, it looked like paper. He stepped out of the car. His shoe leather crunched on the wet gravel. 1 step, 2 steps. He didn't run. Kings don't run. He walked toward the door with the terrifying inevitability of a coming storm. The door exploded inward. It wasn't a breach. It was an erasure. The lock shattered, sending jagged shards of iron spinning across the concrete floor. The sudden violence of the noise ruptured the stagnant air, popping the eardrums of the man standing closest to the entrance. For a fraction of a second, a microsecond that stretched into an eternity, the guards froze. Their brains couldn't process the image before them. A silhouette framed by the gray afternoon light, a fedora tilted low, the barrel of a Tommy gun rising. Then the world turned to fire. The roar of the Thompson was deafening. It wasn't a rapid-fire staccato. It was a continuous tear in the fabric of reality. Brrrr. Bumpy didn't spray and pray. He painted the room with lead. He moved the barrel with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra of violence. The first burst caught the guard by the door in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him back into a stack of crates. Dust and sawdust exploded into the air, creating a fog of war within seconds. Illinois Gordon stepped in behind him, the shotgun barking like a cannon. Boom! Another guard went down. Thomas Johnson squeezed his eyes shut. He felt the heat of the muzzle flashes. He heard the wet thud of bodies hitting the floor. He smelled the acrid, burning scent of cordite flooding his nose, overpowering the lavender and the fear. 60 seconds. From the moment the boot hit the wood to the moment the firing pin clicked on an empty chamber. 60 seconds to dismantle a crew that Lucky Luciano had handpicked. Bumpy walked through the smoke. He stepped over the bodies of the men who thought they were untouchable. He didn't look down at them. They were already part of the past. He walked straight to the wooden chair in the center of the room. He pulled a switchblade from his pocket. Snick. The blade caught the dim light. He sliced the ropes binding his brother's wrists. Thomas looked up, his eyes wide, trembling, expecting to see a monster. Instead, he saw his brother. Bumpy's face was stone, no anger, no joy, just the cold, hard mask of a man who had done what was necessary. Bumpy didn't speak to his brother yet. He turned to the body of the lead guard, the man who had made the call, the man who had laughed. Bumpy reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small white rectangle, a business card. He dropped it onto the man's chest. It landed softly, stark white against the dark wool suit. They thought they had kidnapped a liability. They didn't realize they had mailed a death warrant to their own front door. That 60 seconds of violence is the only reason the history books remember the name Bumpy Johnson, not just as a gangster, but as the man who made the mob blink. That card, and the 7 bodies left to guard it, was the loudest message ever sent in the New York underworld. Like this video if you believe that family is the one line you never cross. And subscribe now, because we are just scratching the surface of the war for Harlem. To understand the betrayal, you have to understand the bond. In the world of Bumpy Johnson, trust was a currency more valuable than heroin and rarer than a clean cop. Bumpy had an army of soldiers, runners, and enforcers. He had 1,000 men who would kill for him for $100, but he only had one man who would die for him for free. They called him the Shadow. He wasn't just hired muscle. He was the only man allowed to stand behind Bumpy when the king sat down to eat. He was the only man who knew where Bumpy slept, which cars he took, and the specific rhythm of his breathing when he was thinking 3 moves ahead. They were brothers in everything but blood. They had come up together from the Charleston streets, fighting with rusty, straight razors before they graduated to Thompson submachine guns. They shared the same scars. They shared the same silence. On nights when the rain lashed against the windows of the Lenox Lounge, they would sit for hours over a chessboard. They didn't need to speak. Bumpy would move a knight. The Shadow would pour the bourbon. It was a ritual of absolute safety. For Bumpy, the Shadow was the only wall between him and the abyss. When Bumpy closed his eyes to think, it was the Shadow's eyes that stayed open. When Bumpy laughed, it was the Shadow who watched the door to make sure no one ruined the joke. The Shadow sat at the king's right hand. He wore the suits Bumpy bought him. He drove the cars Bumpy paid for. He walked through Harlem with the reflected glory of a god. People stepped out of his way, not because of who he was, but because of who he stood next to. And that was the poison. It starts small. A seed of resentment planted in the fertile soil of ego. The Shadow began to wonder why he was always the one standing, while Bumpy was the one sitting. He began to count the money in the bags he carried, realizing that while he held the weight, Bumpy held the wealth. He started to hear the whispers of his own ambition, a dangerous voice asking why a lion should serve a man who read poetry. He looked at Bumpy across that chessboard and stopped seeing a brother. He started seeing an obstacle. He started seeing an old man occupying a chair that might fit him just as well. Bumpy, the grandmaster who could predict the moves of the police, the politicians, and the Italians, made the classic mistake of the brilliant. He assumed that loyalty was logical. He assumed that because he had lifted the Shadow up from the gutter, the Shadow would be grateful forever. He forgot that when you feed a wolf from your own plate, eventually the wolf starts looking at your hand. The Italians saw the crack in the armor before Bumpy did. The Genovese family had been trying to break Bumpy's grip on Harlem for years. They had tried force. They had tried politics. They had tried waiting. Nothing worked. Bumpy was too smart, too entrenched, and too dangerous to attack head-on. So they decided to rot the empire from the inside. They invited the Shadow to a meeting downtown, not a back alley, but a white tablecloth dinner. They treated him like a dignitary. They poured him vintage wine that cost more than his father made in a year. They didn't threaten him. They seduced him. They spoke to him in low, respectful tones. They told him that Bumpy Johnson was a relic. They said Bumpy was holding him back, treating a general like a foot soldier. They asked him how it felt to be the muscle for a man who got all the headlines. They dismantled his loyalty with flattery. They told him he was the real power in Harlem. They told him that the only reason Bumpy was alive was because the Shadow allowed it. And then they slid the envelope across the table. It sat there on the white tablecloth like a bomb. $50,000, cash, untraceable. It was enough money to buy a house, a business, a new life. It was a ticket out of the Shadow and into the sun. The Italian capo leaned in, his voice sounding like gravel grinding on glass. He didn't ask the Shadow to go to war. He didn't ask him to storm a fortress. He asked for something much simpler. He asked for a single mechanical failure. The Shadow didn't say yes immediately. He hesitated. For a fleeting second, the memory of 20 years of brotherhood fought against the greed. He remembered the times Bumpy had saved his life. He remembered the oath they had sworn. But then he felt the weight of the envelope. He touched the paper, and the brother died. In his place sat a traitor. He nodded once, a barely perceptible dip of the chin. He accepted the contract. He agreed to erase the King of Harlem, not with a war, but with a whisper. He agreed that the next time he stood behind Bumpy Johnson, he wouldn't be guarding his back. He would be looking for the soft spot between the ribs. The Italians smiled. They paid the bill. They knew the war was over. They had just bought the keys to the kingdom for the price of a luxury car. The air in Harlem changed. Bumpy Johnson was a predator, and predators have a sixth sense for danger. He couldn't point to it. He couldn't prove it. But he felt the shift in the wind. The streets felt colder. The laughter in the clubs felt forced. He started noticing the small things. The Shadow was quiet. Too quiet. He stopped making eye contact. He stopped pouring the drinks first. He started standing a little further back, a little deeper in the dark. Bumpy tried to dismiss it. He told himself it was the pressure of the life. He told himself he was getting old, getting paranoid. This was his brother. This was the man who had pulled him out of the East River when he couldn't swim. To doubt him was to doubt himself. One night, Bumpy tested the water. He sat in his office, cleaning his spectacles, looking vulnerable and small. He spoke softly to the Shadow. He talked about retirement. He talked about getting out of the game, maybe moving to a farm upstate. He offered the Shadow a way out, a chance to take a pile of cash and leave the life before the bullets found them. It was a lifeline. Bumpy was giving him a chance to confess, or a chance to leave with his honor intact. The Shadow turned from the window. He forced a smile. It was a brittle, hollow thing. He told Bumpy he wasn't going anywhere. He said he was with him until the end. He said, "I got your back, Bumpy. Always." Bumpy put his glasses back on. He looked at the man he loved like a brother, and for the first time, he saw the lie. He saw the glaze over the eyes. He heard the rehearsed rhythm of the words. Bumpy nodded. He accepted the lie. But under his desk, his hand drifted to the drawer where he kept his razor. He knew then that the end wasn't coming from the police or the Italians. He knew the Reaper was already in the room. Betrayal never comes from your enemies. It always comes from the hand you shake. It comes from the people who know your secrets. What time is it where you are watching this? Let me know in the comments as we move toward the night the gun jammed. The trap was sprung on a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that feels like a Sunday because the rain had washed the streets clean of everyone but the ghosts and the gamblers. It was 3 a.m. at the Bay. Lenox Lounge. The band had packed up hours ago. The last trumpet player had drained his glass and walked out into the wet Harlem night. The main floor was empty, smelling of spilled gin, floor wax, and the stale perfume of the night's dancers. But in the back room, the zebra room, the lights were still low. Bumpy Johnson sat in his usual booth. The red leather was cracked and soft, worn down by years of sit-downs and payoffs. He was tired. It was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes from holding up the weight of a kingdom for too long. He had his shoes off. He was massaging the bridge of his nose, his eyes closed, listening to the rain drumming against the alley door. He wasn't alone. Or at least, he didn't think he was. The shadow stood by the door. Usually there were two other guards, Shorty and Red. But tonight, the shadow had sent them home. He told them the boss wanted privacy. He told them he had the watch. He told them to go get some sleep. It was a small lie, but small lies are the bricks that build a tomb. Bumpy heard the silence before he heard the threat. He realized the ambient noise of the other guards shifting their weight, coughing, or striking matches was gone. The room was too quiet. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator behind the bar and the frantic beating of a heart that wasn't his own. Bumpy opened his eyes. He didn't turn around. He looked into the mirror hanging behind the bar. In the reflection, he saw the man he loved like a brother. He saw the sweat beading on the shadow's upper lip, glistening in the amber light. He saw the hand disappear into the jacket. He didn't see a bodyguard anymore. He saw a stranger wearing his friend's face. Bumpy didn't reach for his own weapon. It was too late for that. The math didn't work. The shadow was 5 feet away. Bumpy was seated, trapped in the booth. By the time Bumpy could move his hand to his hip, he would be dead 3 times over. So he did the only thing he could do. He stayed still. He watched the reflection. He waited for the end of the world. The shadow raised the .38. The barrel was dark, a hollow eye staring at the back of the king's skull. This was the moment the Italians had paid for. This was the moment the envelope of cash had promised. All the shadow had to do was squeeze 4 pounds of pressure against the trigger, just a twitch of a finger. In that second, the shadow wasn't thinking about the money. He was thinking about the chessboard. He was thinking about the time Bumpy paid for his mother's surgery. He was thinking about the soul he was about to sell. But greed is a loud voice. It shouted over the conscience. The shadow took a breath. He steadied his hand. He tightened his grip. We return to the flashpoint, the millisecond of eternity. The physics of a gunshot are simple. The trigger releases the hammer. The hammer strikes the firing pin. The pin hits the primer. The spark ignites the powder. The explosion drives the bullet. It is a chain reaction that had worked millions of times in the history of violence. The shadow squeezed. The muscles in his forearm contracted. The hammer snapped forward. It should have been a roar. It should have been the sound that ended the Harlem Renaissance. It should have been blood on the red leather booth. Instead, there was a sound that was louder than any explosion. Click. Metal hitting dead metal, a misfire, a dud round, a light strike. Call it bad manufacturing. Call it a dirty firing pin. Call it the ghost of an ancestor putting a finger between the hammer and the pin. The gun failed. The shadow froze. His brain couldn't process the failure. He had checked the weapon. He had loaded it with fresh rounds. It was impossible. Panic, cold and electric, surged through his veins. He didn't drop the gun. He tried again. Desperation took over. He pulled the trigger a second time. Click. The cylinder rotated. The hammer fell. And again, silence. 2 bullets, 2 failures. The mathematical probability of 2 consecutive misfires on fresh ammunition is so low it borders on the miraculous. And then, the predator woke up. Bumpy turned around. He didn't flinch. He didn't duck. He looked at the shadow with an expression that wasn't fear. It was pity. The shadow stood there, the useless gun shaking in his hand, looking at the man he had tried to kill. He realized in that moment that he hadn't just failed a contract. He had failed destiny. He dropped the gun. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. He fell to his knees, not because he was pushed, but because his legs could no longer hold the weight of his shame. He covered his face with his hands and began to weep. It was the ugly, jagged sobbing of a man who realizes he is already dead. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. Bumpy didn't reach for his razor. He didn't call for the other guards to drag the traitor to the river. He simply stood there, watching the man cry. He poured a drink. He placed it on the floor. When Bumpy finally spoke, his voice was soft. It sounded like gravel rolling in the surf. He didn't ask why. He knew why. He knew the Italians. He knew the money. He knew the weakness of the human heart. He told the shadow to stop crying. He told him to look up. Bumpy looked him in the eye and told him the truth. He said that the gun didn't jam by accident. He said that the universe had just held a referendum on the shadow's soul, and the verdict was in. He told him, "I can't kill you." The shadow begged. He pleaded for Bumpy to end it. He asked for the mercy of a bullet. Living with the knowledge that he tried to kill his brother for an envelope of cash, that was a torture worse than hell. Bumpy shook his head. He told him that killing him would be too easy. Killing him would make him a victim. Bumpy said, "You're already dead. The man I trusted, he died the minute you took that money. The man on the floor, I don't know him, and I don't kill strangers." He exiled him. In the underworld, exile is a fate worse than execution, to be stripped of your name, to be stripped of your protection, to walk the streets knowing that you are a ghost, invisible to the people who once respected you, hunted by your own guilt. Bumpy told him to leave Harlem. He told him to run. He told him that if he ever saw his face again, the gun wouldn't jam a third time. The shadow stood up. He left the money on the table. He left the gun on the floor. He walked out into the rain, shivering, a man without a country, without a brother, without a soul. Bumpy Johnson locked the door behind him. He went back to the booth. He sat down. He listened to the rain. And for the first time in 20 years, he drank alone. Down in Greenwich Village, the Italians were waiting. They sat in a back room that smelled of espresso and avarice, watching the telephone. They had paid $50,000 for a phone call. They were expecting to hear that the king of Harlem was dead, that the territories were open, that the numbers racket was finally theirs for the taking. They waited. The clock on the wall ticked past 3:30. Then 4:10. Then the sun began to bleed through the heavy velvet drapes. The phone never rang. Instead, a courier arrived at dawn. He wasn't a soldier. He was a street kid, terrified, clutching a brown paper bag. He walked into the club, dropped the bag on the table, and ran before anyone could ask his name. The capo opened the bag. Inside, there was no bomb. There was no severed finger. There was the $50,000, every single bill, and on top of the stack, a single chess piece, a black king. The message was clearer than a gunshot. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just alive. He was untouchable. He didn't need to keep their money. He didn't need to go to war. He was returning their bribe because he wanted them to know that their currency held no value in his world. He was telling them that luck hadn't saved him. Power had. Shiver went through the room. Men who had killed without blinking looked at that chess piece and felt the cold breath of the grave. They realized that they hadn't just missed a target. They had angered a force of nature. For the next decade, the Genovese family would not cross 110th Street. They had learned the hard way that you cannot buy the throne from a man who owns the pavement. The aftermath of that night didn't appear in the newspapers. There were no police reports filed. But the atmosphere in Harlem shifted permanently. The legend of the clique spread through the tenements and the pool halls like gospel. They whispered that Bumpy Johnson was bulletproof. They said he had made a deal with the devil, or perhaps with God. But Bumpy knew the truth. He wasn't bulletproof. He was just awake. The betrayal changed him. The man who had once played chess with his guard down, who had laughed with his back to the door, was gone. In his place stood a king carved from ice. He became more isolated. He surrounded himself with silence. He realized that the cost of the crown was absolute loneliness. He continued to rule Harlem for 30 more years. He fought the police, the federal government, and the changing tides of the heroin trade. He went to Alcatraz and came back, his head still high. But he never again let a man get close enough to see the sweat on his brow. He never again trusted a brother without checking the chamber of his gun first. History is often written in blood, but sometimes it hangs on the silence between the heartbeat and the bang. Think about the mechanics of that moment. A spring compressed, a hammer fell, a firing pin struck a primer. It is a chemical reaction that had worked millions of times before. But in that specific second, in that specific booth, on that rainy Tuesday, physics took a breath. If that bullet fires, Bumpy Johnson is a footnote. The power vacuum in Harlem tears the city apart. The Italians take over the numbers. The history of black organized crime ends in 1952, but it didn't fire. And because of that one mechanical failure, that one defiant click, an era survived. We like to believe that we are the masters of our own destiny. We plan, we strategize, we build empires. But in the end, we are all just standing in the rain, waiting to see if the hammer falls or if the gun jams. Bumpy Johnson walked out of the Lenox Lounge that night and lived to become a legend. The shadow walked out and became a ghost. And the difference between the king and the ghost wasn't skill or strength or money. It was 1 millimeter of lid that refused to burn. If you are watching this, ask yourself, who is standing behind you right now? And if the world went silent, would you trust them with your life? If you want more stories from the shadows of the underworld, hit that subscribe button. Tell us in the comments, was it luck, was it fate, or was it the professor staying 3 moves ahead? I'm watching the comments. And remember, keep your friends close, but keep your back to the wall. This is Untold Mafia Stories. We'll see you in the next chapter.